The sun bore down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of a nearly deserted gas station parking lot. Heat waves shimmered from the ground, distorting the air like a feverish mirage. The faint scent of gasoline lingered, mixing with the dryness of dust and burnt rubber. Somewhere in the distance, an old neon sign flickered half-heartedly, buzzing like an insect caught in a web. Jack Harrison stood by his black pickup truck, wiping sweat from his brow as he absent-mindedly adjusted his grip on a gas pump. He had driven down this lonely stretch of highway too many times to count. Yet never before had the place felt so unbearably stagnant. Jack had once been a man of purpose, a name that commanded respect, a police officer with an unwavering sense of duty. But all of that had crumbled the day his wife and son were taken from him in an accident so sudden, so cruel, that he had never truly recovered. Now, he was just a shadow of who he used to be, a man who moved through life on autopilot, avoiding conversations, avoiding people, avoiding everything that once made life meaningful. The world had lost its color, its purpose, and Jack had no interest in trying to paint it back. As he absent-mindedly placed the gas nozzle back into its holder, something on the edge of his vision caught his attention, a dark shape lying motionless near the curb at the far end of the lot. It was a dog. At first, Jack barely glanced at it. Dogs wandered the streets all the time. Some got lost, some were abandoned. He had learned, in his years on the force, that the world had no shortage of cruelty. Still, there was something about this one that made him pause. The Labrador was nothing but skin and bones, its ribs jutting out like a broken fence. Patches of fur were missing, revealing raw, irritated skin beneath. Its head lay against the hot concrete, rising and falling with each labored breath. Flies buzzed around its ears, but the dog didn't even have the strength to swat them away. Jack's first instinct was to look away. It's not your problem. But the universe seemed determined to shove its indifference in his face. A man in a crisp suit, briefcase in hand, walked past the dog without so much as a sideways glance, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. A group of teenagers, laughing loudly, barely gave it a passing look, until one of them, a lanky boy with a cruel smirk, took a sudden step forward and kicked the dog's side. The impact wasn't hard enough to send the animal flying, but it was enough to make it let out a weak, pitiful yelp, curling in on itself as if expecting worse. The group cackled before walking off, their voices fading into the distance. Jack's jaw clenched. He should have said something, done something. But he didn't. Not his problem. Not his fight. A woman, middle-aged, well-dressed, caught sight of the scene and tightened her grip on her purse, as if afraid that the dog might somehow rise up and attack her. She took a wide step around it and hurried toward her car, not even sparing it a second glance. Jack exhaled sharply, turning away. His hands curled into fists at his sides, the muscles in his jaw tightening. The old anger flared up, the one he had buried under layers of exhaustion and grief. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. He forced himself to take a step toward his truck, reaching for the door handle. And then, a sound. A weak, almost imperceptible whimper. He froze. Jack turned back, his gaze locking onto the Labrador. The dog had moved, just barely. Its frail body shifted slightly, one paw scraping weakly against the concrete. It wasn't much, but it was a plea, a desperate, wordless cry for help. Jack shouldn't have cared, should have driven away. But something inside him, something that had been dead for a long time, stirred. His feet moved before his mind had fully processed it. The heat pressed down on him as he crossed the parking lot, his boots scuffing against the pavement. As he approached, the dog's sunken eyes flickered up to meet his. Jack crouched down beside it, studying the damage. The closer he got, the worse it looked. Wounds covered its frail frame, some old, some fresh. The dog didn't even try to move away, just trembled under his shadow, its breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Tentatively, Jack reached out. The moment his fingers grazed the dog's matted fur, it flinched, its body curling instinctively away. Jack exhaled, withdrawing his hand. How long had this animal been suffering? How long had it been waiting for someone, anyone, to notice? He shouldn't do this. He wasn't in the business of saving anything, not anymore. But as he watched the dog struggle to lift its head, only to fail, something inside him broke. Jack muttered a curse under his breath. Then, against every rational thought, against every reason he had to just walk away, he reached down and carefully slid his arms under the dog's frail body. It was lighter than he expected. Too light. The dog whimpered softly but didn't resist. Jack rose to his feet, his grip firm but careful. He could feel the animal's rapid heartbeat against his arm, its body trembling as if unsure whether to trust him or not. He turned, walking back toward his truck, ignoring the stares of the few bystanders who had actually bothered to notice. Jack opened the passenger door and gently placed the dog on the seat, grabbing an old sweatshirt from the back to lay beneath it. The Labrador's breathing remained shallow, but as Jack shut the door and moved around to the driver's side, he could feel those tired, broken eyes watching him. Jack slid into the driver's seat and let out a slow breath. He should have been questioning why he was doing this, why he cared. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was running on autopilot. He turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. Jack threw the truck into gear and pulled onto the highway, heading straight for the nearest vet clinic, his mind racing, heart pounding. For the first time in years, he had a reason to act. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one who needed saving. Jack sat in the driver's seat of his truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The engine rumbled in idle, the heat pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. He stared at the cracked asphalt ahead, trying to ignore the faint sound of whimpering behind him. He had made it to the truck. He could still drive away. He could pretend he hadn't seen the dog, pretend it wasn't lying there, barely clinging to life. It wasn't his problem. Hadn't he done enough for the world? Hadn't he given everything only to have it all ripped away? His wife, his son, all gone in the blink of an eye, leaving him with nothing but silence and an endless ache in his chest. Jack let out a slow breath, his fingers loosening on the wheel. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the Labrador's frail body still lying in the same spot. It hadn't moved. Maybe it wouldn't. Jack squeezed his eyes shut. He told himself to leave. Told himself he didn't care. But then, why was his heart pounding? Why did the image of that dog's lifeless eyes make something tighten inside him, something he hadn't felt in years? Because deep down, he knew the truth. He knew that if he drove away now, if he left that dog to die alone, he wouldn't be any better than the people who had walked past it like it was nothing. And if there was one thing Jack hated more than anything, it was being like them. His gut twisted, the old instincts kicking in. That same relentless sense of duty that had once made him a good cop. The one thing he thought had died with his family. It was still there, still buried beneath all the grief, the anger, the exhaustion. And it refused to let him walk away. Jack exhaled sharply and pushed the truck door open. The blast of heat hit him immediately, but he barely noticed it as he strode back toward the dog. Rocky lay motionless, ribs rising and falling in uneven breaths. His fur was a mess of dirt and scars, his body too weak to even flinch at the sound of Jack's approaching footsteps. Jack hesitated. He crouched down, his boots scraping against the pavement. The dog's eyes barely flickered open at the movement, dull and unfocused. Jack reached out. The second his fingers brushed against the matted fur, Rocky tensed. A tremor ran through his frail frame, and he instinctively tried to shrink away, his body coiling in on itself like he expected pain to follow. Jack froze. His chest tightened at the sight. How many times had this dog been hurt before? How many hands had reached for him, only to strike instead of comfort? Jack swallowed against the lump in his throat. "Easy," he murmured, keeping his voice low, steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." Rocky didn't understand the words, but something in Jack's tone must have registered. The trembling didn't stop, but the dog stayed still. Jack moved slowly, gently placing his hand on Rocky's head. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Rocky let out a weak, shuddering breath and stopped trying to pull away. Jack's throat tightened. The dog was too tired to fight anymore, too tired to be afraid. Jack had seen that kind of exhaustion before, in people who had been through hell and back, in those who had been beaten down by life so many times that they simply stopped expecting kindness. He wasn't about to let that be Rocky's last memory of this world. Making up his mind, Jack slid his arms beneath Rocky's frail body. The dog let out a soft whimper as he was lifted off the burning pavement, his body barely weighing anything at all. Jack held him close, feeling the rapid, unsteady heartbeat beneath his palm. The dog's ribs pressed sharply against his forearm, a painful reminder of how long he had been starving. Jack stood, turning toward his truck. A few bystanders watched in silence, eyes flickering between him and the broken creature in his arms. None of them said anything. Jack didn't care. He strode past them without a second glance, his focus only on getting Rocky to safety. He reached the passenger side and pulled open the door. Carefully, he placed Rocky onto the seat, using an old sweatshirt from the back to cushion him. The dog barely moved, too weak to do anything but breathe. Jack shut the door and moved around to the driver's side. His heart was still racing, but this time it wasn't from hesitation. He slid into his seat, gripped the wheel, and started the engine. Without a moment's hesitation, Jack pulled out of the parking lot, his truck kicking up dust as he sped onto the highway. He had no plan, no idea what he was doing. All he knew was that he couldn't let that dog die, because for the first time in years, he had made a choice that actually mattered. And maybe, just maybe, this choice would change everything. Jack's truck roared down the darkened highway, headlights slicing through the night. The wind rushed past the windows, but inside the cab, the only sound was the labored breathing of the fragile creature beside him. Rocky lay curled on the passenger seat, barely moving, his ribs rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The sweatshirt Jack had placed beneath him was already speckled with dirt and blood. Jack gritted his teeth and pressed harder on the gas pedal. The town's small veterinary clinic came into view, its dimly lit sign flickering against the night sky. Jack didn't even bother pulling into a proper parking space. He jerked the truck to a stop in front of the entrance and was out of the cab in seconds. Carefully, he scooped Rocky into his arms. The dog didn't resist. He was far too weak to struggle now. Jack pushed through the glass door, his boots hitting the tiled floor with urgency. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, looked up in surprise. "Sir, we're about to close." "I need a vet," Jack cut in, his voice rough. "Now." She opened her mouth, likely to protest, but then her gaze dropped to Rocky. Her expression changed instantly. "I'll get Dr. Carter," she said, disappearing through a side door. Jack shifted his grip on Rocky, feeling the dog's frail body tremble in his arms. He could feel his heartbeat. Too fast, too faint. Seconds stretched like eternity before a tall, silver-haired man in a white coat appeared, wiping his hands on a cloth. Dr. Henry Carter had been the town's vet for as long as Jack could remember. The man had kind eyes, but his no-nonsense demeanor made it clear he had seen more than his fair share of tragedies. "What happened?" Dr. Carter asked, already motioning for Jack to follow him into an exam room. Jack laid Rocky gently on the metal examination table. The dog let out a weak whimper but didn't have the strength to do anything more. "I found him like this," Jack said, stepping back to let the doctor work. "Someone left him to die." Dr. Carter hummed in acknowledgement as he ran his hands carefully over Rocky's thin frame. His brows furrowed as he examined the scars, the raw skin around what used to be a tightly wound chain around the dog's neck. Jack watched, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "How bad is it?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Dr. Carter exhaled heavily, standing straight. "Severe malnutrition. He's been starving for weeks. The wounds on his legs and neck suggest he was chained up for long periods, possibly in a confined space." He shook his head. "And these scars, they aren't just from neglect. He's been in fights, probably forced." Jack's stomach turned. Dogfighting. He had seen it before, had been called to break up illegal rings back when he was still on the force. He knew what happened to the ones who lost too many fights. They were dumped like trash. Jack felt the burn of anger rise in his chest, but he forced it down. It wouldn't help Rocky now. Dr. Carter pulled out a stethoscope, pressing it against the dog's side. A long silence stretched between them as he listened. Rocky lay completely still. Too still. Jack's breath caught when he saw the faint rise and fall of Rocky's chest slow down. Dr. Carter's face tightened. His heartbeat is weak. He adjusted the stethoscope, listening again. Too weak. Jack stepped forward instinctively. "What does that mean?" Dr. Carter hesitated before meeting Jack's gaze. "It means you should prepare yourself. He may not make it through the night." The words hit Jack harder than they should have. He didn't know this dog. Had no reason to care. And yet, Jack's jaw clenched. He looked down at Rocky, lying so small and fragile on the table. A dog that had already suffered more than any living thing should. Jack exhaled slowly and placed his palm gently on Rocky's head. "If you live," he murmured, voice rough with something he couldn't name. "I swear you'll never suffer again." The dog didn't react, didn't even twitch. Jack swallowed against the knot in his throat. Dr. Carter nodded solemnly and turned to prepare fluids and antibiotics. "We'll do everything we can," he assured, "but he's got a long road ahead." Jack nodded, but he wasn't going anywhere. Not until he knew. Not until he was sure. Jack stayed. He didn't know why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. The clinic was silent, save for the soft beeping of a monitor and the occasional rustling of papers as Dr. Carter worked nearby. Jack sat in a stiff chair beside the exam table, his forearms resting on his knees as he watched the slow rise and fall of Rocky's chest. The fluids were working, barely. Dr. Carter had done what he could. Now it was up to Rocky to fight. Jack had never felt so powerless. Hours passed. The clock on the wall ticked away the time, but Jack barely noticed. At some point, Dr. Carter had patted his shoulder and left him alone in the dim room, murmuring something about getting some rest. Jack didn't move. His fingers curled, then uncurled against his palms. He wasn't the kind of man to pray, not anymore. But tonight, he found himself silently willing Rocky to hold on, to prove that life wasn't just suffering, that maybe, just maybe, there was still a reason to fight. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, as the sky outside shifted from black to the softest shade of blue, Jack felt something against his hand, a faint pressure. He looked down. Rocky's paw rested lightly against his fingers, a barely there touch. The dog didn't lift his head, didn't move beyond that. But for the first time, he had reached out. Jack swallowed hard, his throat tight. Slowly, carefully, he reached up and placed his hand on Rocky's head. This time, the dog didn't flinch. For the first time since Jack had found him, he didn't pull away. And for the first time in a long, long time, Jack felt something shift inside him, too. The days that followed were slow, uncertain, and filled with quiet battles neither Jack nor Rocky fully understood. Rocky had survived the night, but barely. He was weak, fragile, and still too wary to trust the hands that had saved him. The vet had warned Jack that recovery wouldn't be easy. "It'll take time," Dr. Carter had said. "He's been through a lot, physically and mentally." Jack wasn't sure if he was prepared for that. He wasn't a man of patience. He never had been. But when he looked at the frail creature curled up on the blanket in his living room, ribs still visible beneath his dull black fur, he knew one thing. He wasn't giving up. The first few days were rough. Rocky barely moved. He lay on the old dog bed Jack had placed in the corner, his eyes dull and tired, watching the world pass him by as if he weren't sure if he was allowed to be part of it. Jack would sit near him, never too close. Just enough to let the dog know he wasn't alone. Food was a battle. Rocky wouldn't eat at first. He would sniff the bowl Jack placed in front of him, then turn his head away. It wasn't just that he was weak. He didn't trust that the food was really his. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't used to this. He had no experience with broken creatures, at least not ones that didn't wear a badge and carry a gun, but he wasn't about to let Rocky waste away. So he tried something different. Instead of placing the food down and stepping back, Jack sat on the floor, holding a small piece of soft chicken in his palm. Rocky's nose twitched. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, cautiously, he stretched his neck forward and took the offering, snatching it so quickly Jack barely felt it leave his fingers. Jack didn't move. He just watched as the dog chewed, his body tense as if expecting someone to take the food away. No one did. A few minutes passed before Rocky slowly, hesitantly took another bite. And just like that, a small wall between them crumbled. Each day was a small step forward. Rocky started eating more, though he still flinched at sudden movements. He still shrank back when Jack got too close too fast. But there were moments, small, almost insignificant moments, where something changed. One night, Jack was sitting on the couch, flipping through an old book he had no real interest in reading. The room was silent, the only sound the occasional crackle of the heater. Then he felt it. A presence. He looked down to find Rocky standing a few feet away, watching him with those same hesitant, weary eyes. Jack didn't say anything. He just waited. Rocky took a slow, careful step forward, then another. And then, to Jack's quiet astonishment, the dog curled up on the floor beside the couch, not too close, not touching, but close enough. Jack let out a slow breath. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Days turned into a week. Rocky still didn't act like a normal dog. He didn't wag his tail, didn't jump up excitedly when Jack walked into the room. But he followed him. At first, it was subtle. Jack would walk from the kitchen to the living room, and a few minutes later, Rocky would appear in the doorway, watching. Then, one morning, Jack walked outside to get the mail. When he turned around, Rocky was standing in the doorway, ears perked slightly, tail lowered but not tucked. Jack raised an eyebrow. "You following me now?" Rocky blinked. Jack smirked. "Suit yourself." He didn't say it, but something inside him warmed at the thought. That day, when Jack sat down at the kitchen table, Rocky laid down at his feet. That night, when Jack turned off the lights, he heard the soft sound of paws against the hardwood floor, settling down just outside his bedroom door. Little things. But to Jack, they meant everything. It happened on an ordinary morning. Jack was pouring himself a cup of coffee, his mind still foggy from sleep, when he felt eyes on him. He turned to find Rocky sitting near the kitchen entrance, watching him. Jack sighed, setting his mug down. All right. You hungry?" Rocky didn't move. Jack grabbed the dog food and poured some into the bowl. As he placed it down, he caught sight of something he hadn't seen before. Rocky's tail. It moved, just the slightest wag. A small flick at the tip, hesitant but real. Jack froze. He felt something in his chest tighten in a way he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Rocky lowered his head and started eating, unaware of how much that small gesture meant. Jack exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well," he murmured, "guess we're stuck with each other now." Rocky didn't respond. But for the first time since Jack had found him, he didn't look so lost. It had been weeks since Jack had found Rocky on the side of the road, broken and barely breathing. Since then, the dog had come a long way. He was still cautious, still carried the scars of his past, but he had grown stronger. Each morning, he waited by Jack's feet as the coffee brewed, his eyes following Jack's every move. Each night, he curled up near the couch or just outside Jack's bedroom door, a silent but constant presence. Rocky was no longer just a stray Jack had saved. He was family. So when Jack heard the knock at the door that afternoon, something inside him tensed. It wasn't the kind of knock from a friendly neighbor or a delivery guy. It was firm, deliberate. Jack set his coffee down and moved toward the door, instinct kicking in before reason. His past as a cop never truly left him. He could feel when something was off. When he swung the door open, he was met with the sharp, professional gaze of Agent Matthews, a federal officer whose presence alone told Jack this wasn't just a casual visit. The man was dressed in an official-looking jacket, his badge clipped neatly to his belt. Behind him, a police cruiser was parked by the curb. Jack's stomach tightened. "Jack Harrison?" Matthews asked. Jack crossed his arms. "Who's asking?" The agent pulled out a small notepad and flipped it open. "I'm with the state task force handling illegal animal trafficking. A few days ago, we raided an operation smuggling dogs for underground fights." Jack's jaw clenched. He had seen the worst of humanity in his time as a cop, but dog fighting had always been something that left a particularly bitter taste in his mouth. "Good for you," he said gruffly. "What's that got to do with me?" Matthews studied him for a moment before glancing past him into the house. His eyes landed on Rocky, who was standing a few feet behind Jack, ears perked, body tense. Jack shifted slightly, blocking the agent's view. "We have reason to believe that dog," Matthews said, motioning toward Rocky, "is one of the animals taken from the ring. He could be evidence in the case." Jack felt something cold settle in his chest. "Evidence?" he repeated, his voice low. Matthews nodded. "We need to take him in for further evaluation." Jack let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "You're out of your damn mind if you think I'm handing him over." "Mr. Harrison?" "No." Jack's voice was firm, unwavering. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "Rocky isn't some piece of evidence for you to lock away. He's my dog." Matthews sighed, as if he had expected this reaction. "I understand that you've formed a bond with him, but if he was part of this operation, we need to verify it. He could have been stolen. There might be an original owner." "Original owner?" Jack let out a bitter laugh. "You think anyone actually cared about him before I found him bleeding to death on the street?" Matthews didn't answer right away. He shifted his weight slightly, watching Jack carefully. "I get it," he said finally. "You want to protect him. But if he was part of an active crime legally, we need to process him." Jack stepped forward, his voice cold. "You ever seen what happens to the ones you process?" Matthews hesitated. Jack took another step. "I have." His tone was low, dangerous. "They get tossed into an overburdened shelter, labeled unadoptable. You think anyone's gonna fight to keep him alive if I hand him over?" Silence. Rocky let out a low whine behind Jack, shifting nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Jack exhaled sharply, reining in his temper. He knew Matthews wasn't the enemy. The guy was just doing his job, but Rocky wasn't going anywhere. "He stays with me," Jack said finally. "I don't care what paperwork you have. I don't care what policy you're following. He's not going to be another number in some system that doesn't give a damn about him." Matthews studied him for a long moment before sighing, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Look, I don't want to take him, but legally—" "Then I'll fight legally," Jack cut in. Matthews blinked. "Excuse me?" Jack's expression was stone. "I'll get a lawyer. If you want to take him, you're going to have to go through me." Matthews let out a frustrated breath, but there was something else in his gaze now, reluctant respect. "You sure about that?" he asked. "This isn't going to be easy." Jack glanced down at Rocky, who was still standing by his side, watching him with quiet trust. Jack had never been more sure of anything in his life. "I've been through worse," he said. Matthews sighed again, shaking his head. "All right," he muttered. "Guess I'll be seeing you in court." With that, he turned and walked back toward his car. Jack didn't move until he heard the engine start, watched the car pull away down the street. Only then did he exhale, rubbing a hand over his face. Behind him, Rocky stepped closer, pressing his nose lightly against Jack's leg. A silent question. Jack crouched down, running a hand through the dog's fur. "Don't worry, buddy," he murmured. "No one's taking you from me." The courtroom was colder than Jack expected. The air conditioning hummed softly, and the smell of old wood and paper filled the space. It was the kind of room where lives were changed, where decisions were made by people in black robes who didn't know you, who didn't care about the weight you carried. Jack sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the polished surface. Across from him, Agent Matthews sat beside a stern-faced prosecutor, the two of them murmuring quietly. At Jack's side was David Collins, an old friend from his police days, now a defense attorney with a reputation for taking cases that shouldn't have been winnable. Jack hadn't wanted to ask for help. He had spent years keeping himself at arm's length from the world, from people. But Rocky had changed that, and now he had to fight to keep him. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the judge, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, took his seat. He glanced at the file before him, flipping through a few pages before looking up. "We are here today to determine the custody and ownership of a Labrador retriever identified as Rocky," the judge said, his voice calm but firm. "The prosecution argues that the animal is evidence in an ongoing investigation and must be transferred into state care. The defense claims that Mr. Harrison has rightful custody. We will hear arguments from both sides." Jack's stomach tightened. The prosecutor, a well-dressed man with a clipped tone, stood first. He turned to the judge, his voice steady, professional. "Your Honor, we understand that Mr. Harrison has an emotional attachment to the animal in question. However, the fact remains that this dog was most likely part of an illegal operation. There is no legal documentation that states Mr. Harrison has any right to keep him. He found the dog on the street. He is, by all definitions, a stranger to it." Jack clenched his jaw. A stranger. Had a stranger carried Rocky into the vet's office, praying he would make it through the night? Had a stranger spent weeks coaxing him back to life, teaching him to trust again? Jack forced himself to stay quiet as David rose to his feet. "With all due respect," David began smoothly, "the law is meant to protect the well-being of those involved. If we are discussing legal rights, let's also discuss responsibility. Mr. Harrison didn't just find Rocky, he saved his life. He took in an abused, neglected animal, gave him medical treatment, care, and a home. That is not the action of a stranger. That is the action of a guardian." The prosecutor shook his head. "That's irrelevant. The animal is evidence in a criminal case. He needs to be placed in proper care." David smirked. "Proper care? Your Honor, let's be realistic. We all know what happens to dogs in custody of the state. He'll be placed in a shelter deemed too traumatized for adoption, and within months, he'll be euthanized." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge held up a hand. "I expect order in my courtroom." He turned back to the prosecutor. "Is this true?" What would happen to the dog if placed in state custody? The prosecutor hesitated. That would be up to animal services, Your Honor. Jack scoffed under his breath. He had seen too many cases like this. Dogs labeled unfit, given no second chances. David pushed forward. Rocky isn't evidence. He's a living being. And more than that, he already has a home. Removing him now would do more harm than good. The judge nodded. Understood. He looked toward Jack. Mr. Harrison, do you have anything to say? Jack hadn't planned on speaking. He had never been one for long speeches. But when he stood and his eyes landed on Rocky, who sat quietly near his chair, watching him with those familiar, trusting eyes, he knew he had to. He cleared his throat, his voice rough from years of silence. When I found Rocky, I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't looking to save him. He paused, his throat tightening. But the truth is, I think I needed him more than he needed me. He swallowed hard. I lost my wife. I lost my son. I walked through every day not caring if I saw the next. Then this dog, this half-dead broken dog, looked at me like I was the only thing in the world keeping him going, and I realized, his voice dropped, raw with emotion. I realized I couldn't let him go. The room was silent. Jack let out a slow breath, his hands gripping the table in front of him. You want to talk about legal rights? Fine. But I don't see Rocky as property. He's not something that can be taken and locked away. He's family. A pause. Then, a sound. A soft shuffle of paws against the floor. Jack barely had time to react before Rocky stood up and walked toward him. Gasps echoed around the courtroom as the dog, who had spent weeks flinching away from human contact, stepped up to Jack's side and wagged his tail, just once. But it was enough. Jack felt his throat tighten as Rocky sat beside him, pressing his head against Jack's leg as if to say, I choose him. No one spoke. No one had to. Because at that moment, everyone in the room understood. The judge exhaled, tapping his fingers against the desk before nodding once. I've heard enough. Jack held his breath. The judge turned to face the prosecutor. There is no clear evidence linking Rocky to the crime scene. Furthermore, there is undeniable proof that he is in good hands. Taking him away now would be unnecessary and cruel. He picked up his gavel. Jack Harrison will retain custody of Rocky. The gavel struck the wood, finalizing the decision. Jack closed his eyes briefly, relief flooding through him. He felt Rocky nuzzle against his leg, and for the first time in a long time, Jack let himself believe in something good. The morning light filtered through the window, casting a golden glow across the small kitchen. The familiar hum of the coffee machine filled the quiet space, a steady rhythm to the start of the day. Jack sat at the worn wooden table, fingers wrapped around his favorite mug, savoring the warmth as he took a slow sip. It was a morning like any other. And yet, it wasn't. Because for the first time in years, Jack felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The weight he had carried for so long, the numbness that had dulled his senses, was finally lifting. It wasn't gone completely. Grief never truly disappeared, but it no longer consumed him. It no longer defined him. A soft sound pulled him from his thoughts. Jack glanced down to see Rocky resting beside his chair, his sleek black fur gleaming under the sunlight. The dog had settled there without hesitation, his body stretched out comfortably, his head resting gently against Jack's knee. It was such a simple gesture, but Jack knew what it meant. Trust. Pure, unshaken trust. Rocky had once flinched at every touch, had cowered at every sound. Now he lay here by Jack's side, his breathing slow and steady, his presence a quiet assurance that he felt safe. Jack exhaled, reaching down to run a hand over Rocky's head. The dog didn't pull away, didn't flinch. Instead, he sighed contentedly, his tail giving a slow, relaxed wag. Jack smiled, a small, genuine smile. the kind he hadn't worn in years. Setting down his coffee, he pushed back his chair and stood. Rocky lifted his head, ears perking slightly as he watched Jack move across the room. Jack grabbed the leather leash hanging by the door. "Come on, buddy," he said, shaking it slightly. "Let's go." Rocky's tail wagged again, stronger this time. In one swift motion, he rose to his feet, padding toward Jack with an eagerness that hadn't been there before. Jack clipped the leash onto Rocky's collar and opened the door. The crisp morning air greeted them as they stepped outside. The world stretched before them, open and inviting. Jack led Rocky down the steps of the porch, out onto the small patch of land that had become their sanctuary. The dog tugged at the leash, not in fear or desperation, but in excitement. And then, with one fluid motion, Jack unclipped it. For a brief second, Rocky hesitated, his eyes flicking up to meet Jack's. A silent question. Jack gave a small nod. "Go on," he murmured. "You're free." Rocky didn't wait. He took off across the yard, paws kicking up soft tufts of grass as he ran. Fast, effortless, happy. Jack watched as Rocky bounded through the open space, his body moving with a grace and energy that had once seemed impossible. There was no fear in his movements now, no hesitation, only joy. Jack shoved his hands into his pockets, his chest tightening, not with sorrow, but with something warmer, something lighter. Rocky had healed, and so had he. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the field, Jack took a deep breath, letting the moment settle deep within him. He had once thought he was saving Rocky, but standing there watching the dog who had once been broken run like he had never been hurt, Jack finally understood the truth. Rocky had saved him too. This heartwarming story is more than just another tale about a rescued dog. It's a testament to the quiet, unspoken ways that healing happens. In a world that often feels indifferent, where wounds, both seen and unseen, can linger for years, the bond between a man and his dog becomes a powerful reminder of resilience. Dog stories like this one don't just speak to our love for animals. They reflect the deeply human need for connection, for purpose, and for second chances. Jack thought he was saving Rocky, but in truth, Rocky was saving him too. Sometimes the ones we think are the most broken end up teaching us the most about strength. Love, even in its simplest form, a gentle touch, a quiet presence, a shared trust, can mend wounds that words cannot. And in the end, perhaps the greatest lesson is this: we don't always choose the souls that change our lives. Sometimes, they find us when we need them most. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.